This is Louie with Rush Hour Ag. Leave your message after the tone.
Hey, Louie, it's Elliott Henderson. Can't wait to tell you about
rolling down the back road, truth riding with the dust, talking agriculture policy with people you can trust. From the field to the Capitol, we're breaking it down. Real talk, real issues from a real farm town. Every hour's rush hour when the work won't wait, so we're cutting through the noise and setting things straight.
What's your rush today, Elliott?
Welcome, listeners, to the Rush Hour Ag Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Elliott Henderson.
And I'm your host, Louie Zumbaugh. So saddle up for what we hope is an exciting and thought-provoking podcast on policies that are being discussed not only in Des Moines, but in the capital, and that we think will definitely benefit your knowledge and understanding what happens in farm policy in your everyday life. So, Elliott, I've been getting questions back home at what inspired me to get into the podcast business. And I'd have to say it was pretty much some of your ideas that did that for me. And we can talk about those ideas a little bit. But that's kind of what inspired it. I didn't know a lot about the podcast business, but what got you involved in it?
Well, it's kind of a first generation farmer. I really struggle with getting into farming. And I see that, the future of farming has the same challenges that I have. And I think it's getting worse every day. So, I look at the policy that's been in place and the things that we've done in the last 100 years in agriculture. And I see that, modern policy is starting to hurt our opportunity for the next generation. I think now is time to take some action on it.
And so one of those ideas that you had that inspired me and it happened to inspire me on a personal level because my wife Deb and I were working on our estate and whatnot. And you were talking about stepped up basis and how bringing that forward to allowing someone to take that ahead of their death. And I guess that's what really got me involved with working with you amongst a couple other of your ideas. And that one really intrigued me because as someone that's getting close to retirement, it affects me financially right off the bat. And not only if you were allowed to have your stepped up basis early, you could then, while you're still alive, guide how your farm continues.
I see too many operations today where, you're forced to rule from the grave, and it, without involvement in your farming operation, even while you're alive, it's just not successful unless you're able to participate in the day-to-day decisions. So why don't we make these decisions while we're alive and promote the tough decisions while we're alive instead of delaying these decisions till after we're dead? I've seen so many families, squabble over decisions that come to light after families or, family members pass on. And there's got to be a better way. So if we could just do the step up in basis while we're alive, I mean, as far as from like a tax standpoint, we're not missing out with them taxes. We're never going to get paid anyway, because after you passed on, the family wasn't going to pay them. So why not just do it while we're alive?
Well, it's easier said than done sometimes, but that was the one that really got me involved with interested in talking with you and about that. You had some other ideas that were going on, and this one actually, we've kicked it off to a United States congressman who we're going to have on an episode in the coming weeks when it works out with his schedule. But he was definitely interested in it. And you're right. If you do it correctly, it doesn't really cost the federal government anything because if you wait till you pass away, you automatically get it to a certain extent. I mean, I still think you have to have a top level where it doesn't go over, so you don't have the Bill Gates of the world that cash in on $300 or $400 million. So I think you do have to have a level there in that.
Because like right now, what is it, 20 some million, I think, and
I
before you have to start paying higher taxes. And this country really was founded on breaking up, dynasties. The history of the United States has been pretty strong about not having a lot of inheritance passed on from generation to generation.
Well, I don't know if you're really correct about that. I think the Rockefellers and all those people have done
Sure,
pretty good job at passing on their and there's a overabundance of things you can watch on the internet on how to supposedly do that. But this one was what really intrigued me to get involved uh, with this because you have other ideas that, and we don't always agree. And that's just part of where we're at in life. I'm on the retirement end, and I don't want to. I still want to have something for retirement, and some of your ideas would no offense, but not leave much money left for me. But you starting out would get it all
Oh, what's an example that you're thinking of?
that you brought forward.
Yeah.
Uh, some of your ideas on older folks not using their land as their IRA.
Sure.
Which I don't understand that because essentially, if you've been farming your whole life, it is your IRA.
Kind of, but I make the argument that why don't we do this for every type of real estate? Strip malls and other types of commercial property assets, and let that
You mean
income be forgiven on that too,
you mean
not taxed.
you mean the stepped up basis part?
No, I mean the thing that you're talking about, where I've proposed, you know, that it's bad to have tax-free income on these assets. So, like your example that you're bringing up is the cash-free the tax-free cash rent, as your IRA income, right? That's what you're talking about income coming in off of
Right.
rented farmland.
Right.
Well, why should farmland only have that provision in it? Why can't we? Why aren't we doing that with everything else?
Well, I'm fine with that, but that was the one thing you didn't like about doing farmland is it was one reason that farms weren't changing hands.
I totally agree with that. I think that prohibits farmland from changing hands because there's no incentive then to transition that to the you when you were the younger guy. There was a time when people stepped out of that, had to liquidate the asset so that they could afford their lifestyle. Today, we cash rent it out, afford a lifestyle, and now we're going to reward that with tax-free income. I think we're on a very slippery slope doing that.
Was it tax free always?
No, just recently, and now in Iowa here, they've just recently
Right.
passed the law
Was that this year or last year?
2023, I think, is when it first came to effect
For farmland also?
for farmland. I mean, that's all I know of. The farmland is going to be income on farmland is
Well, if you're
tax-free.
retired, they were going to quit taxing retirement. And then that came in, and I think they had to redo that so that that farmland also was considered your retirement.
Right, and that, so
But I think it is. I bought these farms. I don't have a stocked up IRA
right,
from
right,
and I wasn't in public service long enough to have a big IPERS fund.
right.
So my farmland is my retirement.
But
And
even
I
like,
don't understand why you don't think that's right just because you want to get into farming.
so if your IPERS account, right, sitting with money in it is your asset, right?
Well,
Okay.
mine's not very big, so
Right,
but
but people that have an
sure,
IRA, right? So you
well,
got your
if you've worked for the state of Iowa or the county your whole life, you'd have an IPERS account.
sure, you'd have an IRA, you'd have a fund with money in it. You can't just rent that fund out and get income on it. Like you have to divest it. You have to liquidate that to be able to capitalize on that. Well, why wouldn't we do the same thing with your asset, your land?
But those people could still have something besides the IRA that they're doing that with. I just don't believe that you're correct in that you should force people to sell their land.
And I'm not saying force them, but I'm just saying we should not be incentivizing them to hold on to it.
Well, that goes back to where our compromise is a stepped up basis.
I think it's a good
that
policy.
we were talking
Yeah.
about earlier. That would at least allow someone that was interested in selling it to have an avenue that didn't cost them an arm and a leg to sell it.
Right.
So that's where our agreement came in on that.
Uh,
Another thing that you brought up the last time when we were in Commodity Classic in Denver,
mhm.
what is that called? Conservation?
Yeah, conservation easement program.
Yeah.
So,
Tell me a little bit how you see that working out.
So, most conservation easement programs, when you think of them, you think environmental, right? Well, this program is more cultural. So you're going to protect working farms and ranches, or the culture of agriculture, the culture of being on a farm. So like out in Denver or even in Georgia, these other states have programs where they're rewarding keeping that farmland. And I think we need something like that here in Iowa, where we protect the culture of farming and we incentivize through property taxes or even like an income tax credit is another way of doing that. to where if you're going to be that operator on that land, there should be an advantage to that. And that should come in through the form of property taxes like in Georgia or income tax like in Colorado.
So do you have any personal experience in this in Georgia or anything? Or
Nope,
no?
just from just trying to immerse myself in what systems that have been put in place elsewhere that have been successful, and we currently don't have anything here in Iowa that does that.
No, the closest thing we have is the natural heritage, perhaps.
Which I believe is another
That's
one
a
that's
conservation
very
minded.
environmentally minded, not
Yes,
so
yes.
much the cultural mind that we're talking about here.
No, you're correct. It would be more.
What really inspired me to look at that was I watched these communities start to, I don't know, they just seem like they're withering on the vine. There's no real prosperity in these communities anymore. Restaurants are closed and businesses can't stay open. Strip malls and department stores are closing, and there used to be a wonderful economy here in Northeast Iowa, but today I just really see it struggling. So,
Well, as we drove over to Slater this morning, we definitely noticed that there's one or two Casey's in nearly every town. Uh,
well, Casey's they're a great store, but there used to be somebody that lived in that town that operated that store. Well, now a lot of these franchises or stores that are in these towns really just take the wealth out of that town and don't really bring it back.
yeah, I agree with that. I mean, my little town of Coggin used to have a movie theater, two grocery stores, a bowling alley, I think. That was long before. Some of that was long before I can really remember.
Well, and that,
But part of that just is the economics of scale and mobility of today's world. I mean, it used to be I'm about 35, 40 minutes from Cedar Rapids, and that was maybe a once a month thing. Maybe you did when you had to go to the orthodontist
right.
or something. But now, we drive to Cedar Rapids like we used to drive to Coggin. It's just life has changed, and
Yeah.
I don't know that some of your policies are going to really bring any of that back.
Well, ag land, it all comes back to the land, I think. So when you look at land like in Buchanan County alone, where we've got 27,000 acres now owned by people that don't live in the state of Iowa, where, previous generations, that land was all owned by people that lived here. They made their margins off of that land and then they spent that money locally. Well, today, these big rent checks, some of these rent checks are $400 or $500. That's $400 or $500 never going to get spent in my hometown. It's just gone and gone forever. Those folks don't even come
400 or
back
$500
an acre
per
for
acre
rent.
for rent.
Yeah. Where that used to be, somebody's margin where they would be able to pay their mortgage or put money in the bank down on Main Street. That money's gone now. It's just never coming back
To the
to the local communities.
right, but you're talking absentee loaners,
Absolutely.
landowners.
Yeah.
Uh,
And now as these land prices have gotten so big, the entrance into farming, the young folks coming into farming, they can't afford to be able to acquire this land for purchase. The asset values have gone astronomically higher than the wages have kept up with inflation.
so I think that's part of the hitch is you have absentee landowner issues, but you also have just the folks that are retiring. And I think those folks have every right to their rent check. Uh, how do you see differing between those two?
Why aren't we selling more land on contract? If it's an income thing while we're alive or in our waning years of life, why aren't we incentivizing this transition to happen? If it's a cash flow thing as we're nearing our our terminal years or whatever you want to call them, why don't we just maintain that cash flow but transition ownership so that that next generation can start building equity at a younger age, just like generations before us were able to do?
I mean, every farm I bought, it seemed like at the time I was paying too much for it,
Sure.
and seemed like, oh, that was a daunting task. Um, how do you know land today at say it's $15,000 an acre? How do you know that in your early 40s?
Yep.
How do you know by the time you're in your mid 60s that that's not going to be worth $100,000? I mean, for me, it started out at the farm crisis at
Right.
700 or 800 to now being worth 15 or more.
It's a valid argument. And, hey, if we all start raising 600 bushel an acre corn at $5, yeah, it probably will be worth that. Or if there's new government programs that kick in and have great cash flow, but there again, I don't think the answer is throwing more money at the problem. Could land values go up? Maybe. But really, what's supporting the price of land? It's not just outside investors, it's also farmers with a lot of equity. Well, those farms are going to continue to get bigger and bigger. You know, I don't disagree with the free market, but I do think we need some policy in place that promotes entrants coming into the market, not just those that are here and that are big continue to get bigger.
Sure. So, Elliot, we talked just a little bit ago about the conservation easement program, which, although it has the word conservation, you're looking at it more as being agricultural continuing,
More like cultural, right? So like the
cultural.
culture of agriculture. So, the
Keep
lifestyle.
the farms farms.
Yep, keep the farms, keep that, that family on the farm, that
Right. And I know that when you first told me about that, your idea about that, it rang a bell because we happened to be in Colorado, and I remembered a documentary about a man that actually, I believe got it started there. His last name was Hannah, I believe.
Yep.
I kind of hinted that you needed to watch that. It was more about his life than I remembered it after you sent it back to me.
Kirk Hanna, I think was his name.
Okay, but definitely was inspirational in getting it started there. One thing that they do that I know we differ on, our agreement on this, is they have it for perpetuality. Tell me why you think that's a good idea.
So the perpetual, it's forever once you do it. I think if you put it to a term, somebody that's always at the end of that term is going to be able to capitalize on the benefits of that action. Plus, if you don't make it perpetual, the value of it isn't as great. So, as far as a tax credit standpoint, which is how this would work, well, you're not going to diminish the value of that land enough to make it worthwhile for that tax credit.
The thing I don't care about the perpetuality part, and they actually told us about a situation, I don't remember what town it was, where town is now built up completely around this
I
ranch.
think it was Colorado Springs.
Could have been. I don't remember the town. But so now you have a ranch that's completely got town on all four sides of it. They're landlocked in. They can't get out of it because they've done this conservation
Hmm.
equity
Conservation easement.
conservation
Yep,
easement.
but
And
it's
that's why I think perpetual is just too long. I understand your argument about it, but eventually, as that town keeps growing, they keep becoming more isolated as a farm.
one thing I think that
And
they've messed up though is like where what they're trying to do is prevent urban sprawl. Totally different than what I think we're trying to do here in Iowa. But here in Iowa, why don't we just make that where you could transfer it? So if you've got a 40-acre parcel that's in this easement, allow it to be transferable.
so it'd be like buying a wetland.
Like a 1031, you just exchange it. Or the wetland thing, yeah.
There's a whole number there's another whole nother subject, the
Sure.
1031 exchange, because at one time you told me you were against them.
Yeah,
So if you're against the 1031 exchange, which that's fine, it's your right you can be for or against whatever you want, but now you want to use it.
so I'm not against 1031 exchanges. I'm against the abuse of them. Folks selling rock quarries and then buying 3,000 acres of farmland that they can cash rent out. I think,
Okay. All right.
farmland for farmland, I'm not against 1031 on it. Like kind.
So that's another subject. So when it comes to the wetland part, the way I understand it, I've never done this, but if I want to tile through a wetland on my farm, I can do that if I buy another wetland somewhere else and trade it. Is that how that works?
I'm not familiar with that, but I wouldn't think it'd be like that. I think it'd be more like if you had a wetland, you'd need to probably create
One somewhere else. Maybe
wetland
it is
somewhere
create.
else.
Well, we'll have to get an expert in
Yeah,
that on the
that'd be
show.
a good thing, yeah.
And yeah, we're not pretending to be experts in all of it. We just have ideas that we want to talk about. But I do think I don't mind your conservation easement idea. I think that's a good way to keep the farm the farm. It probably keeps it in a family easier. Uh, but the perpetuality of it for me is a problem.
What's
I-
the problem that you see other than like the urban sprawl part?
Just that eventually, in this case, it kind of becomes I don't want to say obsolete, but their farm can't really grow. In this case, the ranch isn't going to grow. It's farm all around. It's town all the way around it. They may get to a point where if there's just nobody left there that's going to ranch it, and it's now, you know, 4 or
So
5 or 6 miles into town in every direction. I
I
just think there comes a point in everything that it just becomes unrealistic that it stays.
I think the one circumstance that you're talking about, there's a solution to that. I think you make it transferable.
And
I agree with you. That's a big problem.
but if you
especially
make it
out there.
transferable, it could also then not last long enough to be really useful either.
Why not? Because even if you transferred that parcel to another location, that parcel will always be tied to those same restrictions.
True, but if your idea was to try to keep, and this was for urban sprawl, but if your idea was to try to slow some of that down, I could be 1031 exchanging this every year.
So I'm not trying to prevent urban sprawl, but what I'm trying to do is promote operators on the land.
Right.
So if you were to put this parcel into this easement program, the requirements would be that you have to actively be operating that land. And the time, when you decide to be done operating it, it can't be 6 generations removed living in England or California that just continue to own this parcel as an income source. Like, this parcel has to always be available for somebody that's going to live on it or live near it and operate it themselves.
But I see your idea of being perpetual and your idea of exchanging as being competitive toward each other. I just
You have to explain
I
that, I
don't see
guess.
them working that well together. Well, you want to be perpetual forever, but you're gonna be willing to let me exchange it. So I buy this farm,
Hmm.
I put it in the conservation program to preserve it as a farm. But Walmart comes along, and would like to have that property. Oh, I'll just exchange it for this one.
Yep.
So now you're taking one off the market over here from somebody else farming because I'm trading it for this one. But it's been the program because I was in the program here, so I moved the program that I was here over here. So it's still in the program, but it's not solving your problem
But that one was never in the program. You had to
no, but
exchange it.
this one's not in the program now either. So it didn't leave any more land for anybody to farm. It didn't help any new young farmers starting. It, if you're willing to let them exchange at any time, all you're doing is reshuffling the deck.
But you still got a deck, though. Right now, we don't have a deck. And you're gonna continue to. It's not like you're gonna have a certain number of them. That's gonna be it. If this was something that people would adopt and there was an incentive to do it, like, for example, you could take the value of that farm, whatever the easement puts on it, and lowers that value with those restrictions. That difference is what's available in a tax credit. So you really only get a one-time use of that. So as you continue to spread this from other farms, you'll see that grow. But I understand.
So in your situation that we were just talking about,
Mhm.
Walmart comes wants this piece of land.
Mhm.
Okay, who gets that extra money?
That's a great question. So the way I would write it into it is that extra money then would go to the nonprofit. What do we call that?
That's running the
That's running the
conservation
conservation easement. That's right.
easement.
Yep.
So now all of a sudden, I don't mean to pick your idea apart,
I
but
like it. This is a
I'm
good
going to.
conversation.
So now all of a sudden you have the nonprofit that runs this, and and I'm big on a believer that there's no such thing as a nonprofit. Nonprofit, they are all the same in the fact that they are one thing. They have one thing in common. You know what that is? All nonprofit. They are simply an IRS designation. That's all a nonprofit is. They're nonprofit, so they don't have to pay taxes in the IRS. Don't matter if you're the local fair, you're what's the big one? United Way,
Sure.
whatever. If they are truly nonprofit, they're going to be broke.
So it's a
So
land trust. It's not like these
I
type
get what
of
you're saying, but
contracts.
now all of a sudden, we have, and I don't, I'm
Yep.
just, I feel like I'm shredding your idea.
No, that's good because people need
But
to
that's
hear
part
that.
of why we get along so good is
Right.
because we don't take offense to us shredding each other's ideas. So you have this property. Walmart comes to town.
Let's say they pay double what the
Now you may
market
not be,
value is.
so you may not be, you're not going to benefit from it. So maybe you don't have any incentive of ever doing that. But now you have your nonprofit that's running the conservation ease.
Mhm.
They want you to do it because that's who's going to profit from it.
Sure.
So now we have even more head baiting going on.
So
And
right now, the land trust, they need to keep, let's say, I think it's 10% is how they operate right now, where they take 10% of that tax credit value and they use that. Actually, they use 2% of that. The farmer would get 90% of the tax credit.
okay.
The land trust gets 2%, and then the entity that needs the tax break, they actually get to use that 8%. So of 100%, the entity buying the tax credit captures an 8% basis. The land trust keeps 2%, and then the farmer gets the 90%. So, as far as this Walmart
Yep.
example, you know, let's say that farmer took advantage of this program. It was $10,000 an acre ground. Now it's worth $5,000 an acre because it has this
Right.
easement on it. So they qualified for the $5,000 of credit.
So you're going to pay grandpa, for instance,
Sure,
uh, just say it's 10,000 and let's just say the tax break's 50%,
sure.
just to make it easy to
Yep.
figure. So grandpa's actually going to receive $5,000.
Grandpa would receive 10,000.
He'd receive 10,000.
Yep. But then whoever the new owner is that would take advantage of this program would qualify for the break. So let's say it
So
takes that.
who's covering the other 5,000?
So let's say you're grandpa and I'm buying the farm from
Okay.
you. I write you a check for $10,000 an acre. I go to the land trust, say, hey, I'm going to put these restrictions on this parcel. I'm going to lower the value of that land. Let's say 5,000 for easy numbers. So we've lost $5,000
Yep.
in value because of these restrictions we put on it. The land trust then takes that $5,000 of value and through the state gets a tax credit. And some company like John Deere or Apple or whoever, Amazon, they need the tax break. They then buy that tax credit from the land trust. The land trust keeps 2% of it, and the farmer gets a check for 90% of it. So the difference is 8, right? 92 to get to 100, you have 8%. So that buyer then capitalizes on that 8% value. So let's say it's $1 million, right? So they've got the entity, Amazon, whoever it is, say they got $1 million tax burden. They can go to the land trust, buy this tax credit from the land trust, and instead of paying $1 million of their tax burden, they really wrote the check for $1 million, but then they got 8% back. So not only did they not spend $1 million, they saved that 8%. So they got the money back for that 8% value. So 8% on $1 million is $80,000. They lowered their burden by $80,000.
Then it was 100,000.
So it was $1 million,
It was
right?
a million. And they lowered it.
8% is not 80,000.
So not a lot.
Well, call it 10 million.
And grandpa still paid the full boat.
No, Grandpa didn't pay nothing. He
taxes.
got a check.
Yeah, you got a check that he's got to pay taxes on at the full boat.
So does he want to lower the price for grandson or the neighbor kid? I don't know what the answer. That's a grandpa problem, I guess. I'm thinking about the guy getting in.
I get that, but in the case where we go back to our first thing we talked about, then it was a stepped up basis. There's no incentive for grandpa to sell because he's going to have to pay it all in tax. So really, your ideas all have to come together. If you're going to do all this, need to be
So maybe the
merged,
grandpa
sewn
thing
together.
isn't the best situation, but let's look at I don't know, who's a big land investment outfit around us. You know,
I don't really know, I guess, but
you know, there's the Joe Burrow football players are buying land up here in Iowa. You know, Bill Gates is buying up land. If Bill Gates could sell this land and not have to have a big tax burden for the gain on it, you know, that's where you're, you know, what we were talking about originally was the step up in basis fixing it. I'm thinking you brought it up, and the angle with land trust is how do you get people into it, right?
sure.
So you know, it doesn't really address the issue of the person that's selling it, that's making a pile of money on the basis. You know, that's their tax problem. But how do we get young people into it, and how do we make it affordable for them? I think this is a good tool to make it affordable. So you take 10,000, you know, you lower the value of that land through a tax credit program.
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head if you can lower the value, but you have to lower the value for the person that owns it
That's what's
so
happening.
they can make it
So
justifiable in their mind why they'd sell it for less.
they'd sell it for less, but they also would, while they're operating it, own it for less.
Well, your new operator would own it for less.
They would
yeah.
own it for less.
Yeah.
Yep.
I just think that in this whole talking of things, that instead of trading, instead of having perpetual, that you put a number of years on it.
I have a problem with that because as you near the end of that term, that person's going to be able to capitalize on returning it back to fair market value.
That's right.
And I think that's why it doesn't work. And then also when you have so as you near the end of that term and it returns to fair market value, that person then gets to capitalize.
Well, I think that depends on location then, because if you made it 90 years or something, it'd be more than the generation that did it, and it would And it'd be almost a 3-generational thing if you did 90 years. You'd have the generation that was parting with the property, the generation getting the property, and in that time frame, they'd be retiring too, and then third generation would be getting it. Well, by that time, if it hasn't become worth, if towns build up all around it and they're no longer really viable as to what they were doing, yeah, they may choose to sell it. But if they're out in Timbuktu, they would just keep continuing.
So what's the difference, I guess, if they continued it on the parcel they originally had it on, or if they continued it, if they transferred it to a different parcel?
I just think if you let them transfer at any time, I'm not saying transfer is bad, but if you let them transfer it at any time during it, you're just gonna constantly be transferring stuff. Maybe you have a transfer, you can transfer it after X amount of years, you can transfer it once in a lifetime of the deal. I don't know. But I think if you just let them transfer it nilly-willy, you could just be constantly.
Well,
I mean, I know, well, I don't know them well, but I've heard of a couple people that do 1031s. Well, they're constantly 1031ing farms, getting better farms, but
I don't know, maybe I like this idea even more so than I thought. What do you do on the homestead parcel that you really don't necessarily want to lock up in a perpetual, like your homestead there? What if there's a generation that gets skipped and you don't want to have to sell that farm because you're done farming? Well, you could transfer it. You've been able to take advantage of that lower value the whole time you lived on that parcel. It might have been the first parcel you got to buy. It might have been the only parcel you got to buy. And then at some point you realize, shoot, I really wish I wouldn't have done this. But you would be able to transfer it to a different parcel and then just go back to having that parcel be your homestead and not have to sell it because you're done farming. I think the transfer thing would work beautifully there too.
I guess I don't know. I just see the transfer thing being a tool to abuse it.
Okay. It's possible.
And,
I,
like
I
any,
think it's a solution though to the problem of the current system.
yeah, I don't know. To me, the transferring just poses a problem, but
Well,
it all hinges on it selling to start with,
right.
and it all hinges on diminishing the value so that the IRS doesn't take too big a chunk out of anybody for the most part.
Sure.
And I know in Colorado it was to stop urban sprawl. Or
Right.
that's what got Mr. Hanna involved in it, I believe, if you watch the documentary according to that. So we're dealing with two separate things a little bit, but
But I want to go back to this point about putting a limit on it. So you put a limit on it, and then we just go back to the way it was, where we bring back in outside investors to be able to buy that land, people that aren't supporting the communities. Like, I think if we're going to do it, we need to do it and do it for perpetuity.
well, I think there again, if it's surrounded by town, I think you're being a little harsh on people not giving back to communities. I think if it's landlocked, you got 160 acres that's landlocked by Des Moines, and all of a sudden it's worth more money. I think there's a difference between somebody developing that piece of ground. They are giving back to the community. They're raising tax value. They're bringing in buildings that are taxed way higher. They're bringing in things like that. So I think you're being a little harsh saying they don't give back to the community.
But
I think you're
but
talking about the fellow that lives close to Chicago and he's buying ground 60 miles out of any major town waiting for
see, I think
development to get
you're
there.
still thinking about the guy that's owning this parcel that's going to take advantage of selling it being the guy that's there. I think you need to be thinking more like that parcel is owned by some investment group that's been renting it out for the last 40 years and they're going to capitalize on it. Those are the ones I want to stop. I want to see the guys locally owning that parcel that they're going to sell to the town and they're going to trade that and move a little bit further outside of town and continue to farm and own their farmland. The problem I have a problem with is the folks that don't live here, don't support the communities. They're owning these farms. They're speculating on these farms, and then the city's buying them up. But they also, if they did want to do that and speculate, and they want to buy that land, they're just not going to be able to take advantage of this program. I'm not saying they can't do it.
I understand that part. I just think that I think that a lot of what you want to do is a pretty big push, and I don't see legislation going that route.
Well, this is all voluntary.
It's all voluntary, but it still takes legislation to do it,
Absolutely.
and you'll have pushback. Obviously, I keep going back to stepped up basis because I think that's pretty low hanging fruit. That really doesn't cost the government anything other than actually it doesn't cost them anything. It's just a it's just a difference in timing.
I think you could
And
make the argument
and
that it would add value to the economy if you could get folks to transition that land and take an influx of cash. They'll spend that cash.
well, that's true.
It'll be given to grandkids. It'll pay for college. It'll buy a different house or an RV or a boat or new vehicle. I think it would stimulate things, not just be a burden on our society.
Sure. So, Elliot, when we're talking about stepped up basis, I see it as kind of a three angled deal. Number one, you'd have the person like myself that's my wife and I are looking at our retirement, how we can help pass on our farms to the next generation that's farming. And stepped up basis does that because uh, obviously you could do it through trusts and things like that. But if you had stepped up basis early, I could afford to tax wise sell those farms. And in my case, or our case, perhaps we could take less for them because we wouldn't have to be paying the tax. But in the case, I also have landlords that would maybe want to do that, but not take any less money. It would simply be an avenue that they could say, you know what, I've rented to these folks for 30 years. I want to make sure that they get to buy the farm. We've all seen it where they can do that through their will, but yet in the end, it's sold at auction or whatever. Uh, so I can see it being a benefit there, although it's not going to save a person any money. How do you see that as being a service to yourself as a young farmer that's trying to buy ground? I mean, I'm already established. You're starting to buy ground, wanting to expand. How do you see that helping you?
Well, I see a lot of cases where, that person that is alive to make that decision at that time, they're prohibited from doing that because of the tax consequences. So they wait till they die and then they leave it to the kids, and then the kids pick up the phone and call the auctioneer. That 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 desire to see that land sell to that folk down the road that landowner had a relationship with evaporates as soon as they die. So I think it does help. It helps make that happen while they're alive. You'll see that transfer happen while they're alive instead of the inevitable happening where it just goes to the high bidder when the kids get a hold of it.
But it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't sell for every penny it's worth. It doesn't necessarily help you buy it cheaper.
No, and I'm not saying it does, but
Okay.
it at least lets you buy it, where as opposed to it going to the auction
Right,
block, it's
right. So basically, you see that advantage as someone starting out is the advantage is that people can then manage on their own while they're alive where their land ends up.
right. And I'd love to see,
And
more sales on contract.
sure,
There was a lot of sales on contract, I think, before the 80s. And the 80s was pretty hard on that because a lot of farms got given back.
right.
But, if the intention is to sell that farm and then, you need cash flow for your retirement.
I don't know if you know this question would be another great topic to have with another expert. Uh, how did that work when you gave a farm back? Uh,
I
I
know.
mean, I remember it happening
Yeah.
also, but what happened tax consequently to the person that got it back? I think that's what was bad, but I don't remember what the circumstances were. I'd like to have someone that remembers that and knows how that works because I think there was tax consequences that went back to the original land owner, but I don't remember what they were
Depends how they
at all.
sold it, I suppose. If they sold it on a contract with a big payment up front, they obviously they had to pay taxes on that. And they
Sure.
might have had to pay tax on the full sale of it, but I don't think that's how it works today. I think if you sell it on contract, you're only paying so much of those taxes as you're taking your income.
I'm not sure that I don't. I'd have to ask a
I
tax
would
expert.
too.
I don't know. I do know I work with different lending institutes, but I did ask one once back in the 80s. You hear them stories of, oh, so and so was maybe forgiven something or something else. And I did ask a loan officer once how that worked. And he explained it to me, and it made sense that this person bought that ground for $4,000 or $5,000 an acre, which in the 80s was a lot of money. He couldn't make it, so they chose to maybe ground. I know ground in our area went down to like $800 an acre. So maybe they chose to, you know what, we're going to write this loan down to $2,000 an acre, and you can keep farming. But it was still $1,200 an acre more than anybody else was willing to give for us. How he explained it and how they justified doing that. Now I know there's people that think, well, that wasn't right, and there's probably people that think it was right. But in the end, it was what worked out for the Lending Institute because they were kind of up a creek if they didn't do something.
Well, and I think that happened, even with people selling on contract. I can think of an instance very
Okay.
close to my home where, the gentleman that retired in the 80s sold it to the young guy at the time who's older than you are today. He had to give that farm back. Couldn't make payments on it anymore after a couple of years of farming in the 80s.
Right.
And that farmer, that person that sold it, they discounted it down. They resold it to him for less than half of what he bought it for the first time. Very fortunate for that gentleman, but I,
Well, it may have been fortunate. It may not have been because he
well,
was still paying more than what it was actually going to burn if they would just sell it to put it on the
possible.
market.
Yeah, very possible.
So fortunate's in the eye of the beholder, I guess. But I would like to get an expert that knows how that all worked out
For the
and actually
tax,
know
yeah,
the
the tax
details
burden
on
on
it.
that.
No, that'd be an interesting story because I don't know exactly how it worked.
But I mean, that's the fear of it. Why don't we sell on contract? It's because of those instances where folks had to take their farms back. There was no indemnity fund that indemnified farms
Sure,
getting back.
sure. Uh, but that's all uh, goes back to my original question is just doing a stepped up basis doesn't necessarily help a young farmer buy anything for any less money. It may if it's within the family, or maybe they just have enjoyed a relationship over 30 years with this family and then they want to see it. Yeah, it's an avenue that could produce a lower price on farm because you could lower it by stepped up basis something, but you wouldn't have to.
And appreciation's a real thing. So, if we can keep our operators owning this land and appreciating land that they're farming, the sooner we can transition that land to the next operator, the quicker they can build equity in their own operation. And I think that's something that we have a problem with right now is that there's this backlag now of turning land over to the next generation to where that next generation has been restricted by a decade or two now of building their own equity.
Sure. And I'd also argue that, the price of land gets looked at a lot, but and we farm, obviously, but the real cost of what's costing farming in a lot of cases is, there's not too many people running a 44 or 40 and a 1086 anymore. The cost of equipment's worse than the price of a farm.
Sure.
And when it comes right down to it, that farm's going to last you forever. That combine's going to last you 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, farmland doesn't depreciate.
Well, not I wouldn't say never, but not like a piece of equipment.
Right.
And so I'm not trying to create arguments with you, although it sometimes seems like
It's
it.
okay.
But just as big of a hindrance to a young person farming, unless they have access to equipment that some people have, some people don't. The cost of equipment can be more burdening than the cost of the farmland.
Well, and like in today's environment, you can get a bargain on a used piece of equipment, but the repairs may cost you more than buying something new.
Well, on the way up here, you were
Yeah.
just talking about a hydraulic block in your planter that could cost $15,000.
Right.
That's crazy,
Yeah, the guys paid 20 for the planner, like it's crazy. But that's exactly what I'm talking about, is those instances. But it all starts with the land. So I guess I want to stay focused on land. How do we how do we how do we get people land? How do we get our families and our farms back on the land? I think the equipment thing, I'll be happy to talk about and address it sometime, but I've really been working on the land part, I guess, more so than I have the equipment piece.
I understand that. I was just trying to point out that equipment can be just as big a burden to a young farmer as the land.
Well, and
Other than the fact that you can buy equipment every day, all day long, and if
Can't
you're
buy
willing
that.
to ride in a 1086 and a 7,000 planter, you don't have to have all the latest and greatest, but you probably won't grow the crop that you will would otherwise.
And if we can make programs work to transition land, certainly we can make programs work for transitioning equipment too.
Sure, John Deere does it every day with John Deere Finance.
Sure you do.
Anyway, just another side angle of what we're working on.
Right.
Well, those are the type of topics that Rush Hour Ag is going to dive into. We hope that you have feedback. We look forward to feedback. We have special guests lined up that are willing to dive into those topics with us, way deeper than what you and I have knowledge of. And we hope that you would enjoy that type of podcast. We hope that you rush back to the next episode. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in.